Okay, this lesson is going to be covering chapter 46 in the book, and there's a lot of things that are in here that I'm going to talk about that aren't in the book, and these are things that I thought were important. But the topic of this lesson is having to do with how humans interact with the environment and how the environment interacts with humans, but mainly the other way around, mainly how humans interact with the environment. And we're going to focus on something called biogeochemical cycles, which you may or may not have heard of. I'm sure you've heard of the water cycle, but there are other cycles to be concerned with. One of the things that is kind of in the news all the time lately, and it's been a big deal the last decade, is this idea of global warming. And so I wanted to start by thinking about that, this is like the main thing you hear about in the news where humans are impacting the ecosystem, impacting the biosphere. And so this is your typical global warming type of graph. I do want you to be critical thinkers, and so one of the things to look at, of course, we have year down here, but we also have departure from long-term mean, and this is in degrees Fahrenheit because it's from a United States, an American website, so we use Fahrenheit. But this is global temperature change from 1880 to 1999, and you want to be looking at exactly this scale. So this is, in terms of change, we're still looking at only less than a 1 degree change from the long-term mean, which, I want you to think about, is that really a huge deal or not? And if it really is a huge deal, why would that be a huge deal? Something just to think about. Now we're going to start by talking about nutrient cycling. And remember, the Earth is a whole set of systems interacting. We talked earlier about the biosphere. There's the lithosphere, which is the solid Earth. There's the hydrosphere, which is the water. There's the atmosphere. And so all of these systems interact in all kinds of ways. And honestly, it is so complex. There is still a lot we don't understand about it. And so as I talk about some of these things in this lesson, I want you to be thinking about, how could the Earth rebound from this? If we have some kind of a negative impact on the Earth, could the Earth rebound? Could it correct itself? The Earth is a complex thing that we don't fully understand. So how much are we really making an impact, and how much of it could the Earth rebound from? But let's start at the beginning. All energy for all living things on Earth comes from the sun originally, and that energy is eventually transferred to plants, and then from plants to animals. So we talk about energy, which actually we're going to talk about next week. Energy is a one-way flow. It comes from the sun and it flows through living things. Matter is different, okay? There is a physical law of matter, the law of conservation of matter, which says that matter cannot be created or destroyed. So when we talk about nutrients, not energy, but nutrients, such as carbon, water, nitrogen, phosphorus, these are in limited supply, and therefore they are cycled between the biotic and the abiotic parts of ecosystems, between different organisms. It's all, you can think of it as like a giant recycling plant. Everything's going to get cycled around. And so we're going to talk now about how things are recycled. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the water cycle. It tends to be something that you've heard of before, and so I don't want to waste a whole lot of time. But one of the things I do want to make you aware of is that when looking at over here, let me get my pencil back, over here, yikes, the total global water, doesn't seem to be wanting to work, so here, we'll just point at it. Over here, the total global water, we're looking at most of the water for the entire planet is actually salt water. It's in the oceans, so it won't be terribly available to living things unless it's fresh water. Of the remaining, only 2.5% is fresh water. And then of that, less than 2%, most of that, about 2% is locked in glacier and polar ice. And so we're left with about 1% of fresh water that living things can access. And of that, some of it is locked in the atmosphere. So really, we're talking about a small amount of water compared to the total on Earth. The oceans contain most of it. And of that small amount, it's going to cycle. There are reserves of water like the ocean, lakes, and the glacial ice, the Arctic ice. And those are kind of like reservoirs. And then you can think of the movement of water as being the times when it's not in the reservoir. And so here's kind of a summary. We have, of course, condensation of water in the atmosphere, eventually raining down as precipitation. It's going to run off the land. Some of it soaks down into groundwater. Some of it runs off into lakes and ponds and eventually the ocean. And then there's evaporation from the ocean and from lakes and ponds and streams, and that returns it back to the atmosphere. As part of that, plants are going to take up some of that water through the groundwater or through the surface water. They're going to take it up in their roots, and eventually it will travel up the plant and be emitted back into the atmosphere through transpiration, or sometimes it's called evapotranspiration. Very important process that we're actually going to study a lot more in the spring. A second nutrient cycle that you need to know about, and I'm going to talk about this as though it were one cycle, but really you can talk about the carbon cycle separately from the oxygen cycle, but they are really closely tied together. Really, we're talking here about the cycle between plants and animals, or autotrophs and heterotrophs. So this is the reciprocal cycling of carbon between the process of photosynthesis and the process of cellular respiration. Now, I hope you know this word autotroph. Autotroph means self-eater. Troph means eat, or to eat. Autotrophs make their own food. So these are things like plants, algae, and photosynthetic bacteria. There's a bunch of different kinds of bacteria that do that. They take up carbon from the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. In their bodies, through the process of photosynthesis, they convert it to sugars and starches, and then they give off oxygen in the process. Oxygen is like a waste product for them. Then animals come along, herbivores, and we call them heterotrophs. That means other eater, heterotroph, and they eat the plants, and they take in the sugars and starches, so the carbon from the sugars and starches is taken into their bodies, and then in the process of respiration, they break it down into carbon dioxide and breathe it out. Okay? In this process, in the process of cellular respiration, they require oxygen in order to do that, and so the oxygen is taken in. So really, carbon dioxide and oxygen are kind of reverse direction in terms of going in and going out. But here's a nice overview if you want to look at this diagram. I thought it was a really nice one, looking at what's going in and what's going out in each of the steps of the carbon cycle. The other thing to know about is that there are huge carbon reserves, not just in living organisms, but also the ocean stores a lot of carbon. The lithosphere, the sediments, rocks, soil has a lot of carbon stored. And, fossil fuels underneath the surface. We're going to talk in a minute about fossil fuels, and that's really important storage place for carbon. And fossil fuels are formed from the remains of living organisms. So sometimes the living organism will be storing up carbon, die, get buried, and become a fossil, and that carbon is still in there in the form of a fossil fuel. All right, a process you may be less familiar with is the nitrogen cycle, also important. Nitrogen is important for living things to produce proteins and nucleic acids. It's important components of those things, enzymes. So it's a nutrient. We need it in our bodies. We have to get it from somewhere. Now, nitrogen makes up the greatest component of the atmosphere. Something like 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen. But the nitrogen that's in the atmosphere is unavailable to us. When we breathe it in, we can't do anything with it. It is a triple bonded molecule. I believe it's N2 with 3 covalent bonds. So it's really strongly held together, and we can't just break it apart and use the nitrogen. We rely on particular bacteria, mainly in soil, who fix the nitrogen. In other words, they can break it down and convert it into something else. So they take this atmospheric nitrogen and they break it down into an ammonium ion, and then other soil bacteria convert that ammonium ion into something called nitrate. Nitrate can be taken up by plants through their roots, and then that's where it enters living organisms. So we rely on soil bacteria to do this for us. Without those soil bacteria, we are doomed. And one of the problems that, we'll get to one of the problems that humans create, and one of the byproducts of that has to do with these soil bacteria. Without them, we can't get nitrogen. We won't be able to survive without them. Now, eventually, again, a heterotroph will consume the plants and take up the nitrogen. And then There are other bacteria that are in the soil that are called denitrifying bacteria that actually take that nitrogen and return it back to the atmosphere in the form of N2. And then as organisms die and decay, the nitrogen in their bodies is converted into ammonium, which will end up coming back into plants as well. Okay. Now, the part that I didn't mention yet is that there are some bacteria that actually live in the roots of plants that can fix the nitrogen. So some of these bacteria are actually in the soil. Other species are in the roots of plants themselves. So that one maybe you're less familiar with. All right, what I'd like to do now is continue on discussing about each of these cycles, but each time thinking about and talking about how humans affect that cycle. So let's start with the water cycle. The main thing that affects the water cycle that humans do is deforestation. We go in and we want to make cities, we want to make agricultural areas, we want to make roads, we want to make houses, all different kinds of things for our own use, and we clear forests. When we do that, it upsets the water balance in those areas because, of course, the trees are transpiring, okay? They're releasing water, and they also hold water in the soil with their roots. And so a lot of that water is now going to go somewhere else because it's not being released from the trees. We're not getting that water. What that leads to is something called desertification. Desertification is when areas become desert-like. And this, of course, happens in areas that have been cleared. And the other effect of deforestation, of course, is nutrients also are not made available. A lot of nutrients are only available in soil that's moist enough. And so a lot of times things cannot regrow the same way as before they were cleared. And then also, of course, we're going to have a lack of diversity in that area because the habitats are removed for the organisms. The other effect of human activities on the water cycle that I wanted to talk about is having to do with just how much water we use. We have a lot of water use now, much more so than in the past, and there are some areas, even like Florida is an example, where there isn't enough water in some areas for our personal use. This is especially true in California right now. They're having the drought and everything, but they'll use groundwater. They'll pull water from the ground. And in coastal areas, when you do that, if the groundwater is dry enough, if you're pulling enough water out, it will begin to pull water in from the sea, and you get what's called saltwater intrusion. So now you've completely contaminated your groundwater, and you have no good water to drink. But those are a couple of effects. Desertification and then saltwater intrusion are two effects on the water cycle from human activities. The carbon cycle is one that you're probably fairly familiar with, the human impact on the carbon cycle. The problem, of course, is in burning of fossil fuels. Because fossil fuels are a sink. We talked about that before, about how fossil fuels are stores of carbon that are sort of locked away and they're not being used. And what we've done is we've pulled them up out of the ground and we burn them. When we burn them, we return that carbon to the atmosphere at a high rate. And so we're taking this huge sink of carbon and we're putting all that carbon back into the atmosphere at a much higher rate than normal. This is obvious. The carbon dioxide levels are going up. The question is that I have, and I'd like you to consider, is exactly what effect, if any, there might be on the planet due to this burning of fossil fuel and putting this extra carbon in the atmosphere. The oceans themselves and plant biomass, plants growing, are huge sinks for carbon. So could it be that the oceans can absorb that excess carbon? I have a diagram here talking about there's really a cycle of carbon within the ocean itself, and photosynthetic organisms take it up, and it's used in turn through respiration at the bottom of the sea by bacteria that break down dead organisms as they die, and then it gets recycled back into the photosynthetic organisms. So could the oceans take that in? Could the oceans take in the excess? Could plants or just phytoplankton, the plankton in the ocean, take up the carbon. Could the planet rebound? Could the planet respond? Many people, of course, are saying that this additional carbon dioxide, could it be having a warming effect? Now, carbon dioxide is one of the greenhouse gases. It's a main one, and it does contribute to warming. We know that. We have seen some warming happening already, but the question is this a natural process, or is this our activities that are causing the warming? Is there a relationship between humans burning fossil fuels and the warming that's going on? That remains to be seen. Another effect of releasing all of that carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, it's actually causing, we're seeing this happening, it's causing a decrease in ocean pH. This is called ocean acidification. So what happens is, I told you the oceans are a sink for carbon. So what happens is as there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it gets taken in by the ocean. It's dissolved in the ocean water. In the ocean water, there's a chemical reaction that occurs causing a formation of carbonic acid. And one or two acidic hydrogen ions break away. Of course, an increase in hydrogen ions is an acid. That's a characteristic of an acid. So we have been seeing a change in ocean pH over time since we've been burning all these fossil fuels. But it's a complex result and not well understood. In fact, there was a recent study done, and I pulled these images from the study. What they found was at a lower carbon dioxide concentration, you see your ordinary sea urchin. At higher CO2 concentration, in other words, acidification, you see the sea urchin is unable to grow its spines. It's obviously malformed and not healthy. On the other hand, we have these little lobsters, and grown in low CO2 concentrations, you see the size. In higher CO2 concentrations, where the ocean is acidified, you see how large it is comparatively. So for some species, having an acidified environment is actually beneficial. So clearly, if you have some organisms not surviving well and some organisms doing better, we are having a huge impact on that ocean ecosystem. There's going to be a change. Question is, what? Okay, this one I just wanted to touch on briefly. I thought it was kind of interesting. This happened over the summer, and I just wanted to point out that some scientists fear that the warming of the tundra soils, we talked earlier in the year about the tundra soils having permafrost, and that underneath the permafrost, they believe there are some methane pockets. Methane, CH4 is also a greenhouse gas. They think it's kind of has a bigger effect than carbon dioxide even. And they believe that if there is global warming, if there's some warming in the atmosphere, if it warms enough, the permafrost will melt, which it's permafrost, it's supposed to not melt, but they think it might melt. And in some areas where it's melting, that it will release these pockets of methane. Now, if that happens and there's a rapid release of methane, they believe that it could lead to a runaway effect of warming, because a lot of methane could cause a lot of warming quickly. So that's kind of an interesting thing to think about and talk about. Recently over the summer, I don't know if you saw this, it was going around the social media, in Russia, they discovered this big crater, and it just goes straight down. It's like this straight down hole. There are still theories about what exactly caused it, but one theory is that it was a pocket of methane that gave off gases. It makes sense because, of course, it's up in northern Russia where there is permafrost, so it kind of makes sense. There are some other theories, but I thought it was kind of interesting, and this did just happen this past summer. Okay, let's change topics a little bit and talk about how humans are impacting the nitrogen cycle. Now, the problem with the nitrogen cycle with humans is that we are continually adding nitrogen to our environment. It's called fertilizer. So if we are growing crops, if we are adding, having lawns, we're adding fertilizer to our lawn. If we have cattle ranches or chicken ranches, their waste products are rich in nitrogen and phosphorus as well. So we could talk about the phosphorus cycle, but I'm not really focusing on that. But the point is, all of this stuff, when it rains, it runs right off into lakes and ponds. It just runs right in there. This causes something called eutrophication. Very important concept to understand. Eutrophication is death of a lake, basically. Due to our activities, either crops, lawns, cattle ranches, excess nutrients run off into our lakes or our ponds. The result is aquatic plants grow crazy because plants dig nitrogen. They love nitrogen. They need nitrogen and phosphorus. And so when they're given a lot of it, they will grow like crazy. They grow so much they kind of choke each other out. Okay, we talked about populations. There's limited space available, and eventually they choke each other out and die. The lake bottom begins to fill with detritus. Detritus is dead stuff. So all of this dead stuff falls to the bottom of the lake and creates sediments. You can see here in this diagram we have some sediments. And it begins to decompose. Decomposition uses a lot of oxygen. The process of decomposition uses a lot of oxygen. What ends up happening is the lake becomes anoxic. Anoxic. That means, let me write it down here. Anoxic. Anoxic means it has no oxygen. It's depleted of oxygen, and of course, all living things need oxygen. So the fish die, the other aquatic organisms, crustaceans die, algae dies, everything dies. As everything dies, it's going to fall again to the bottom of the lake, and this just continues and continues and continues. It begins to fill up and fill up and fill up with sediment, and eventually everything's dead, the lake is dead, and you end up with kind of a marshy thing that stinks and has nothing living in it. We see this a lot in our local lakes because there are a lot of lakes around and we're living around the lakes with our homes. A lot of times the homes around the lakes are very nice. They want to keep a nice lawn. They fertilize a lot, and you'll see this happening. I tried to find a good picture that looks similar to something we see around here. You can see this picture here. All of the aquatic plants along the surface, all the mucky stuff along the edge. If you see that, that is eutrophication happening. So it's very, very common in our area. You see eutrophication. Just as a side note, our Lake Florence that we were studying this year had this problem. It was undergoing eutrophication due to all the houses around the lake. And recently, I think it was in 2011, I think it was 2011, the neighborhood around the lake discovered this was happening and decided to invest in an aerator. So actually in the lake, I found out recently, in the lake, somewhere out there under the water is a bubbler that bubbles and provides oxygen to save the lake. So that's kind of a neat thing that we can learn about Lake Florence. Okay, now this is kind of not relating to the the biogeochemical cycles, but there are other things humans are doing. We talked about invasive species in class, which was very interesting. But the other things that we do include introduction of toxins, herbicides, and pesticides to the environment, and we do this a lot. We are attempting to control our environment, but sometimes we don't know exactly what we're doing, and we do more harm than good. There have been lots of examples of this. For one, pesticides and herbicides, they're to help our food problems because they eliminate the pest organisms, but they also eliminate beneficial organisms and can upset the whole ecosystem. The other problem is that a lot of these chemicals are carcinogenic, that is cancer-causing in humans and other organisms. And the other problem is that they may lead to resistance in the pests, and you end up with stronger strains of pests. We have seen examples of this, so that you have now pest organisms that are immune to all of these pesticides and herbicides that you were trying to use. One of the responses to this problem is biological control. So there have been a lot of research recently into biological control using pests of the pests, natural plant toxins, or sometimes they will develop a strain of sterilized members of that particular pest, release those into the environment, and they knock down the population because they go out and mate with everybody and nothing happens because they're sterilized. So another example, of course, using pests of the pests. You'll see sometimes at Home Depot or at Lowe's, at the places, at the garden centers, you can actually buy ladybugs and release them into your yard. They eat aphids. These little green guys are aphids, and they are harmful to your plants in your yard. So you can actually go buy ladybugs, and they're a natural biological control. You can release those, and they'll eat up your aphids. You can also buy praying mantis. They'll eat all the pest organisms, or you can even buy eggs of praying mantis and let them release into your yard to take care of things naturally. All right, other toxins, such as antibiotics and hormones, are regularly added to our food supply. It is unclear at this time what effect that might have on the human body, and so that's something to look at for the future. I'm sure there's going to be more research coming out about that. And then the other thing to be aware of is that these chemicals that we release into the environment accumulate in the bodies of organisms. Many of them are fat soluble, meaning they can dissolve into fat and stay in the bodies of the organisms. What that means is that predators eat prey with amplified amounts of toxin. So maybe you spray it on the plants, the herbivores eat the plant, and then the predator eats the herbivore, and it's got sort of an accumulated amount of the toxin. So we call this biological magnification, because the effect of the chemical is magnified as you go between organisms, and it preferentially affects top predators. Okay, an example of this, it's a classic example, was DDT. We used to spray DDT on crops, and it was very good at, I think it was a pesticide, controlling pests, and it might have been an herbicide. Anyway, we thought it was perfectly fine. We did a few tests, and it seemed fine. We didn't realize anything about biological magnification. And then we discovered what was happening is the bald eagles and some of the other top predators, their eggs were softened. And here's a picture of DDT eggs, they call them. These are bald eagle eggs that are softened and harmed basically by having high levels of DDT in the mother eagle. And it was because of DDT that we saw such a decline in the bald eagle population. And luckily, it was discovered what the problem was, and they banned DDT in the 70s, in the 1970s. And of course, we know that the bald eagles are coming back, but they were nearly extinct due to DDT affecting their eggs. The young couldn't survive in that egg. The eggs were crushed, and they weren't hatching. And so the birth rate was very low, and of course that declined the population. Okay, last thing, this is the final slide. So if you're getting tired, we're almost done. I need you to understand that ecosystems are dynamic. Whether it's a human-induced change or a naturally occurring change, ecosystems are going to undergo changes. It's always changing in environments. It just is. Some of those, like I said, are caused by humans, and we've talked about those, but some of them are naturally occurring, such as fire or flood or volcanic eruption. Now, we see often in ecosystems a set of characteristic changes that occur. We call this ecological succession. That's the word for it. There's two kinds. There's primary and secondary succession. Primary succession happens when an ecosystem is brand new. Example of this might be new land formed after a volcanic eruption occurs, or maybe there's been a glacier and the glacier is receding and leaving behind rock and soil. The first step in primary succession is to make some soil. Usually it's a rocky surface. There's not a lot of soil there. Once soil is formed by microorganisms, then next you begin to see pioneer organisms such as lichen and mosses. After that, you get formation of soil. You can have small plants growing and then larger plants, etc. Okay, then you begin to see animals coming into the area, and this is depicted here. Bare rock. As time passes, moss and lichen start to appear, and then you get grasses and small plants, and then you get deeper soil, so you can have shrubs, and eventually you get trees. So this is a regular progression of changes in the ecosystem over time. The other type of succession is secondary succession, and this happens whenever there's an established ecosystem that gets altered by some activity, like human activity, or some kind of natural disaster like a fire or a flood. Okay, that's it for the notes. I hope that you got all of that. Obviously, you can listen to it and watch it a second time if you need to.